lie of omission. So with that, we'll just jump into it because I really don't know what else to say besides that. I am disappointed and sad as an American citizen, and I am frustrated, not necessarily because I believe the president intended to lie to us, but I do believe that either he is being misled or he is intentionally misleading us. Either way, this is my chance to do what I think is right and share with you the points at which I believe we are being misled as the American people, as the American public. So let's go.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We're facing an inflection point in history. One of those moments where the decisions we make today are going to determine the future for decades to come.
Now, right away, with the calling out of this inflection point in history, I believe that the president is exactly right. I could not agree with you more, President Biden, on this point. We are at an inflection point. Now, for those of you who don't know what an inflection point is in engineering terms, it's a point in which a piece of steel or a piece of material starts to break under pressure. And in that point of weakness, it has an inflection. And that is where we are for sure. We are at a point of weakness in history. And the question is whether that weakness is American weakness or some other kind of weakness. But without a doubt, we are at a point in our history where we have to decide and make decisions today that will impact our children and our children's children after that. This is a very important moment.
They tell me I'm the first American president to travel there during a war. I met with the prime minister and members of his cabinet. And most movingly, I met with Israelis who had personally lived through horrific horror of the attack by Hamas on the 7th of October.
So let's take a moment to be honest about the Prime Minister of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu is a criminal in the eyes of Israel. He is currently under an indictment and in an open investigation for fraud and corruption. It cost him his prime minister seat in 2019, and it's the reason that Israel's had 3 prime ministers since 2020. Even now, as he sits in that seat since 2022, being re-elected with a total of more than 16 years in the prime minister seat, on October 6th, just before the attacks happened in Israel, Netanyahu was at an all-time low in terms of public support in Israel. He is supported by a far-right, conservative, aggressive, and hawkish government, and he was actively trying to change the court system in Israel so that his indictment and investigation would be terminated. The man that we are talking about supporting here, the prime minister that President Biden met with, is essentially a carbon copy of the Donald Trump persona that we have here in the United States. A strong, hawkish, right-leaning conservative who is currently under indictment and facing criminal charges for corruption and fraud, among other things. So don't think for a second that the prime minister in Israel is a good guy. He is not. He is not supported by Israel. He is under criminal charges. And in many ways, the invasion, the aggression that happened on October 8th is a very convenient way of him to redirect his own people off of his own issues. So don't be misled. And I want to make sure that the world understands that Netanyahu is in no way comparable to our own President Biden.
More than 1,300 people slaughtered in Israel, including at least 32 American citizens.
This is another area that I want to make sure we speak about. Body counts. When we start talking about body counts, this is a phenomenon that really didn't exist prior to the Vietnam War. When the White House and when official public politicians speak about body counts, they're doing it so that they can create some kind of emotional reaction from you and I and the audience watching. We want to hear the number 1,300 and think that it's devastating. Let me give you another number. That other number is 3,700. That's how many Palestinian civilians have been lost in this conflict. You will always hear people talk about the number of Israeli deaths, and it is accurate. It's about 1,400 or more, and there's new dead from the original October 7th attack. However, there has not been another ground attack since October 7th. And in comparison to that, there have been multiple weeks of aerial bombing that have happened inside Gaza that have killed almost 3 times as many Palestinians. Even worse than that, the number of injured exceeds more than 300% in Gaza versus what happened in Israel. So you have 3 times as much damage being wrought in Gaza against civilians, children, elderly, women, families that are simply landlocked in this strip of land that was militarily oppressed and domestically oppressed by Israel prior to the war. So while it is atrocious and sad to hear what happened to Israel on October 7th, we have to also remember that if we're going to count bodies, we need to also count the bodies of the victims on the other side.
As president, There is no higher priority for me than the safety of Americans held hostage.
That is the first lie from the president. He does have higher priorities than the American hostages inside of Israel. Let's face it, he's responsible for 300 million people here in the United States, not just the 34 that he referenced in Gaza. So without a doubt, there are priorities, and the president prioritizes the protection of American citizens. But what he's also not telling you is that many of the American citizens are dual citizenship holders. They are both Israeli and American citizens. So if you're not aware that you can have multiple citizenships, there are multiple countries in the United States where we have a agreement where you can have more than one citizenship. It's kind of up to the American people to choose whether a true American citizen with just one citizenship is any different than an American citizen who carries another citizenship. But it's not as if the Americans were targeted by Hamas in their attack. They were not. Hamas was simply snatching and grabbing anybody that they could, knowing that they needed hostages out of Israel, which is why you saw so many young and old being taken, because there was no plan, there was no intentionality between how Hamas was executing killings versus how they were taking hostages. So I don't want you to think for a second that the president is actually prioritizing the hostages in Gaza as his top priority. They are not. He has many, many other priorities, including domestic policies here in the United States and his own long-term political future as the president of the United States. So I'm going to call you out on that, President Biden. I believe that what you said there was not 100% accurate. I believe that that was what's known as a lie of influence, meaning it was an intentional misleading or possibly a misstatement intended to influence the public in your favor.
The terrorist group Hamas unleashed pure, unadulterated evil in the world.
Now, let's talk about Hamas for a moment, because President Biden just called them a terrorist group. Let's be honest about Hamas. They have been labeled a terrorist group by less than 12 countries in the world. The vast majority of the world, including the UN, does not consider Hamas a terrorist group. Instead, they consider Hamas to be a political party, a force, and the legislative body of the Gaza Strip, elected democratically and in power since 2007. So Hamas, whether we like to admit it or not, has a militant wing, but they are also a recognized political party inside the Gaza Strip. They were voted into power. They have an established leader and a hierarchy. And even worse, they are a party, they are a political party without any kind of citizenship, because the Palestinians who they represent aren't a recognized country. So what that means is that Palestine and Hamas are politically accepted by the majority of the world, right? It's really only the United States, the US allies, Paraguay, and the European Union that see Hamas as an actual terrorist organization, and of course Israel as well. The rest of the world sees Hamas as a political group without a country, and importantly, without a military to defend itself. So I want to make sure that you understand that when the president says that Hamas is a terrorist organization, he's really talking from an American point of view only. In the eyes of the Americans and in the eyes of the Israelis, Hamas is a terrorist group. But to be fair, in the eyes of Iran, the US military is a terrorist group. So it's all about perspective on this one.
But sadly, the Jewish people know perhaps better than anyone that there is no limit to the depravity of people when they want to inflict pain.
Now, for those who are paying attention, let me know if you guys want a part 2 so you can see more of the lies that are being told. And all you have to do is like, follow, and share this video, and a part 2 will come.